You think putting on this uniform means I won't dare break your leg again? In this house, you will always be just a parasitic mutt. The steel-toed boot of my stepsister, Valerie, slammed directly into my ribs. A sharp crack echoed through the room. Blood trickled from the corner of my mouth. Standing right at the doorway, Arthur Bennett, my own biological father, witnessed the entire thing. He stood there, his eyes hollow, arms hanging limply at his sides, calmly watching his own flesh and blood being trampled by my stepmother and stepsister. Not a single word of intervention. "Break her arm too, Valerie." My stepmother, Evelyn, hissed, her voice dripping with an ice-cold malice. "Let's see if this cripple can still hold a gun." But while they were gloating, my thumb traced the shattered screen of the phone hidden in my pocket. 3 deliberate presses. SOS. Sirens wailed and the military police stormed in. The game was over. But before I reveal the terrifying aftermath of that SOS signal, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Don't go anywhere, because what happened next changed my life forever. To understand why my stepmother and stepsister possessed the sheer arrogance to storm onto a heavily fortified U.S. Marine Corps base, you must understand the deadly silent undercurrents that began when I was just 14. I close my eyes and I can still feel the ocean spray biting my cheeks raw. My mother, a brilliant oceanographer, taught me how to read the shifting colors of the water to predict deadly rip currents. She would grip my hand so tight the bones ached, pointing directly at the roaring, white-capped waves crashing onto the Malibu shore. "Never turn your back on the rough waves, Chloe. Charge straight through it," she would tell me, her voice cutting clean through the wind. Our home ran on a precise schedule, every shelf lined with research journals, the air always carrying the faint smell of fresh books and salt. My dad, a literature professor at the local university, was the quiet pillar holding that order together. He graded papers at the kitchen table, while my mother pinned tide charts to the refrigerator door. That entire system, every single piece of it, was obliterated in a single afternoon, shattered by the wailing sirens of highway patrol cars pulling onto our gravel driveway. The officers slowly removed their hats as they stepped onto our porch. My mother's research vehicle had lost control and plunged violently off the Pacific Coast Highway into the rocks below. The exact second the officer finished reading the fatality report, my dad simply broke into pieces. He didn't scream. He didn't shatter glass or punch walls. He just slowly folded his body into himself on his armchair, shrinking down like a dried leaf being consumed by fire. The grandfather clock in the living room stopped ticking that same week because nobody wound it. He locked himself inside his study, burying his face into a growing pile of empty whiskey bottles that collected along the baseboard like amber tombstones. Left utterly alone in a house that now smelled of dust and stale liquor, I taught myself how to operate the microwave to heat up canned soup. I developed an obsessive habit of walking purely on the tips of my toes to avoid making the slightest noise on the creaking hallway floor, desperately trying to maintain a fake order in a clinically dead household. I washed my own school uniforms in the bathtub with dish soap. I forged my dad's signature on permission slips. I was 14 years old, running a ghost house, completely unaware that a far more devastating storm was gathering on the horizon. Barely a few months after the funeral, my stepmother stepped through our front door, bringing a ruthless, suffocating new order. She was a real estate investor, ostensibly hired to liquidate some of my mother's assets to pay off my dad's mounting bank debts. The sharp staccato clicks of her high heels struck the hardwood floor with the cold precision of a crime scene cleaner measuring a room. She wore a tailored gray suit that fit like armor, and her heavy, overpowering musk perfume instantly choked out the damp smell of our collective grief. She operated with terrifying efficiency. She signed checks to clear late bills, sliding them across the counter for my dad's shaking hand. She made hot tea, pressing the warm mug into his palms. She gently stroked my dad's messy, unwashed hair while he sat slumped at the kitchen table. My dad looked up at her with the desperate, hollow eyes of a drowning man clutching a life preserver thrown by a stranger. Within a single week, he surrendered every bank password, every property deed, and his entire will to this woman he had known for less than 30 days. Following right behind her was my stepsister Valerie, a martial arts instructor who carried heavy punching bags through the garage door and swept a condescending glare over me that evaluated my existence as nothing more than a piece of leftover garbage occupying valuable floor space. During our first dinner together, my stepmother effortlessly claimed the head of the table, my dead mother's sacred seat, sliding my mother's placemat into the trash without a word. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a red velvet box. Inside rested a thick silver chain attached to a polished black stone pendant. She stood up, walking slowly behind my chair. Her freezing fingers, tipped with blood-red nail polish, grazed the back of my neck as she fastened the heavy clasp. The cold weight pressed against my collarbone like a shackle. Leaning down, she pressed her lips almost directly against my ear, her voice dripping with venom. "This house now runs my way. Your father is now under my control. You live on my land, eat my food, so you must follow my discipline." I looked across the table, desperate for intervention, searching my dad's face for any flicker of the man who used to read me bedtime stories. He was frantically dragging his knife across his steak, sawing back and forth at the same spot, absolutely refusing to look up from his plate. That freezing necklace was a tracking collar marking the inauguration of my invisible, barless prison. My stepmother maintained her domestic prison through absolute schedule control. Long before the sun rose, I was dragged out of bed by the overhead light, snapping on to scrub every square inch of the ground floor on my hands and knees, using a toothbrush on the grout lines while she inspected behind me with a flashlight. By nightfall, my phone and laptop were forcefully confiscated, locked inside a safe in her bedroom closet. But the true bone-deep physical torture originated entirely from my stepsister's fists. She systematically cleared out our two-car garage, shoving my dad's boxes of old lecture notes into the rain, lining the concrete floor with thick, unforgiving rubber mats, and transformed the space into her personal martial arts dojo. I was never her sparring partner. I was designated as her living, breathing human shield. I had to stand perfectly still on those mats, arms at my sides, absorbing the blunt force impact of her unchecked rage, learning exactly how much blunt trauma a human body could take before the muscles simply gave out and the knees buckled. "Get up! Block the hit!" My stepsister roared, launching a brutal, sweeping roundhouse kick directly into my exposed ribs. The impact knocked every molecule of air out of my lungs, and I crashed hard onto the concrete edge of the mats. The rank, stifling smell of stale sweat and the sharp copper tang of my own blood flooded my nostrils. I stumbled, pushing my bruised body up with shaking hands, my palms slipping on the slick rubber. But before I could even find my center of gravity, a straight right punch cracked squarely against my jaw. My vision swam into white static. I fell again, gasping desperately for air, dragging my body toward the open garage doorway and aiming my pleading eyes directly into the living room where the television light flickered blue across the far wall. My stepmother leaned casually against the garage door frame, swirling a heavy pour of red wine in her crystal glass. She glanced down at the heart rate monitor on her Apple Watch with absolute clinical indifference, checking the time the way someone checks on a roast in the oven. "Poor reflexes. Valerie is just training her how to survive," she remarked smoothly, taking a slow sip. I stared past her legs into the house. My dad was sitting right there on his armchair, less than 20 feet from the garage. The violent thuds of flesh hitting rubber echoed clearly down the hallway, impossible to ignore. He didn't flinch. He didn't stand. He didn't open his mouth. Instead, he simply reached his trembling hand toward the remote control sitting on the armrest and cranked the TV news volume to its absolute maximum, the anchorman's voice booming through the walls to completely drown out the sounds of his daughter's body being broken on concrete. 2 years into the abuse, I secretly took a part-time job at a local bakery 3 blocks away, hiding a thin envelope of minimum wage cash under my mattress. Every dollar went toward a single goal, saving enough for a used car to drive myself out of that house the day I turned 18. One night, I walked out of the bathroom, toweling my hair, to find my stepmother sitting calmly on my bed, systematically counting my crumpled bills and dropping them one by one into her open Louis Vuitton bag. "Insurance and water bills spiked this month. Living under this roof, all resources you generate belong to the family. Don't hide anything," she commanded, snapping the bag shut and tucking it under her arm. Weeks later, the mail brought a thick envelope from the State University, my literature acceptance letter, the only document that proved I had a future outside those walls. My stepmother picked it up from the hallway table, tore it open with one manicured fingernail, and read it silently. She pulled a silver lighter from her pocket and casually set the corner on fire. When I lunged forward to grab it, my stepsister swept my legs out from under me, and I hit the tile floor chin first. My stepmother tossed the burning paper into the kitchen sink and turned on the faucet, watching the black ash swirl down the drain. You will study for an accounting certificate at the community college 2 blocks away. The weak have no right to choose their future. Yuan, my mind was on the verge of being entirely crushed under their weight until I took a graveyard shift janitorial job at a local gym, scrubbing locker room floors from midnight until 5 in the morning. That was where I crossed paths with Master Sergeant Marcus Cole, a retired Marine who walked with a heavy rhythmic thud thanks to a titanium prosthetic left leg. He was always there, lifting weights long before anyone else arrived, the iron plates clanging in the empty room. From the corner of the dimly lit weight floor, he watched my relentless mechanical floor scrubbing, the mop handle rattling in my grip. More importantly, his trained eyes noticed exactly how I gritted my teeth and shortened my stride, desperately trying to mask the limping steps caused by my stepsister's nightly beatings. A long ropey bruise ran from my elbow to my wrist, barely hidden under a rolled-down sleeve. He didn't offer me fake pity or empty civilian platitudes. He studied me the way a veteran recognizes a fellow casualty of war bleeding out on the wrong side of the wire. One morning, he stepped directly into the path of my rolling cleaning cart, blocking my way with his broad frame. Reaching a calloused hand to his thick neck, he unclasped a rusting metal dog tag and pressed it forcefully into my wet palm. The cold metal bit into my skin. His voice was gravelly, grinding together like rusted engine parts. Kid on the battlefield, when a platoon is surrounded, no helicopter is coming to save you. You have to pick up the gun yourself. I flipped the cold tag over in my fingers. The back was heavily engraved with a barcode and a tiny inscription, Psalm 23:4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He locked his piercing brown eyes with mine, and the gym's buzzing fluorescent lights hummed between us. No one is coming to save you. Turn yourself into the rescue force. I closed my fist around the dog tag so hard the edges cut into my palm. Nobody had ever spoken to me like I was worth saving. Later that exact morning, my knuckles still dented from the dog tag's edges, I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the military recruiting office 2 bus stops from the gym. Sergeant Miller sat rigidly behind a perfectly organized desk, beneath a wall-mounted American flag and a framed photo of a carrier strike group. His eyes immediately scanned and cataloged the dark purple bruises peeking out from under my rolled-up sleeves, tracking them the way a medic tallies shrapnel wounds. He didn't ask questions. He simply pulled a thick Marine Corps infantry enlistment file from his top drawer and slid it across the polished surface. This isn't a summer camp to hide, kid. This place will tear you apart. He warned, his voice low and dead serious. I didn't flinch. I placed my hands flat and steady on my thighs, feeling the dog tag pressing against my chest, where I had threaded it onto a shoelace around my neck. I'm already used to being torn apart, I replied evenly. The only massive obstacle left was my age. As a minor, the military strictly required my legal guardian's signature to finalize the enlistment contract, and the only legal guardian I had was a broken man drowning at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. In the dead of night, I crept down the hallway on the tips of my toes, the old habit serving its final purpose. My dad was slumped heavily over his mahogany desk, in the home study reeking of cheap whiskey and defeat. 3 empty bottles stood like sentries beside a framed photo of my mother that he had turned face down months ago. My stepmother was fast asleep upstairs, her bedroom door shut, the faint whir of her white noise machine humming through the floor. I slid the thick enlistment papers and a plastic ballpoint pen right in front of his face, positioning them directly over the wet ring his glass had left on the wood. He blinked heavily, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus on the bold words printed across the top of the first page, voluntary enlistment in the U.S. Armed Forces. His hand shook violently. He could barely grip the pen without his fingers sliding off the barrel. A single pathetic tear cut through the deep wrinkles on his unshaven cheek and dropped onto the paper, bleeding the ink slightly. He forced his fist closed, dragging the pen across the dotted line in a jagged, barely legible motion. The broken signature of Arthur Bennett permanently scarred the paper, the only useful thing he had done for me in 4 years. "Run, Chloe," he whispered into the dark, his voice cracking on my name. Hours later, I slung my backpack over one shoulder, tucked the signed enlistment papers inside my jacket, and walked out the front door without looking back at the house. The dog tag bounced against my chest with each step. I was finally charging straight into the rough waves, and I was never coming back. My dad's trembling signature catapulted me out of suburban hell and straight into an environment 100 times more physically brutal, yet absolutely rigorously fair. Marine Corps selection was a perfectly designed meat grinder, engineered to strip every recruit down to raw nerve and rebuild them from nothing. We endured blaring alarms long before dawn, standing rigid at attention under freezing downpours, while drill instructors screamed inches from my face, the veins in their necks, bulging against their collars, draining my stamina to absolute zero. But I never once collapsed. Every single recruit who dropped beside me in the mud had never been hit before. I had been absorbing punishment since I was 14. At home, I was beaten purely to satisfy my stepmother's sadistic need for control and my stepsister's hunger for dominance. Here I was, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance to be forged into something useful, something dangerous. The distinction was the difference between torture and training. Military discipline fused into my bloodstream like iron supplements. My barracks bed was made so tight that a bounced coin would fly a foot off the sheets. My standard-issue M4 rifle became a seamless extension of my own body, an extra limb I could disassemble and reassemble blindfolded in under 60 seconds. I learned to consciously control my breathing, lowering my heart rate to a dead crawl before ever squeezing a trigger. The ultimate survival test was a grueling 12-mile ruck march through torrential rain, every recruit hauling a soaking wet 60-pound pack that dug trenches into our shoulders. Right at mile 10, my heavy boot slipped violently into a deep, hidden mud trench concealed by standing water. My ankle snapped sideways with a sickening pop that I heard before I felt. The agonizing pain shot from the joint directly into my skull, and I crumpled face first into the cold dirt, my rifle clattering beside me. Sergeant Sloan, a massive Texan who had barely spoken 2 words to me during the entire training cycle, marched past my crumpled form. She stopped dead in her tracks, the rain hammering off her helmet. Without a single word of judgment, she dropped to one knee, pulled thick medical tape from her tactical pouch, and rigidly strapped my swollen ankle with aggressive precision, winding the tape so tight it became a cast. Then she hoisted my heavy M4 rifle onto her own shoulder, alongside hers, the 2 weapons crossing her back like steel wings. "Get up, Bennett," Sloan growled, her sharp eyes scanning the trail ahead through the relentless downpour. "Marines leave no one behind." I grabbed a fistful of mud, pushed my screaming body upright, and finished those last 2 miles on a taped ankle with a stranger carrying my weapon. My stepsister beat me to break my spirit. Sloan carried my rifle because that is what real loyalty looks like. Late that night, soaked and limping, I was summoned into the sterile office of Captain Eva Rostova. Sitting ramrod straight beneath a massive American flag mounted on the wall behind her, her razor-sharp gray eyes dissected me as she aggressively threw my personnel file onto the cold metal desk. The folder landed with a slap. She had pulled my entire background, the police reports from our home address that were never followed up on the ER visits logged under accidental fall. The school counselor notes flagged and then buried. "You are running away from something at home, Captain," Rostova stated flatly, stripping away all pretense, her voice carrying no sympathy and no accusation, just raw surgical fact. "Many victims come here and fail. But you are different. You don't wait for pity. You turn pain into kinetic combat energy. You have the makings of a weapon." Those precise words acted like a bolt cutter, severing the invisible chain my stepmother had locked around my neck years ago at that dinner table. The silver necklace, the stolen wages, the burned letter, the rubber mats, the father who turned up the volume. All of it compressed into fuel. Weak little Chloe was permanently dead. Sergeant Bennett was officially born. 4 years of specialized training later, I was stationed in an on-base federal housing unit, living a life of precise, self-built order. My apartment was clean, sparse, and entirely mine. My military pay was deposited into an account no one in my family knew existed. My investment portfolio, started with combat deployment bonuses, was growing steadily in an index fund I managed from my laptop every Sunday morning. I had not spoken to anyone in the Bennett household in over 3 years. Then, out of nowhere, a glossy Christmas card arrived in my secure base mailbox. I held it under the fluorescent light of the mailroom. The photo depicted my stepmother glowing in a red velvet dress, my stepsister smiling arrogantly at the camera with her arms crossed, and my dad shoved into the darkest blurred corner of the frame like a prop someone forgot to remove. My advanced reconnaissance training immediately flagged a glaring visual anomaly. Beneath a sloppy layer of cheap concealer on my dad's cheekbone was a dark, crescent-shaped purple bruise. The distinct, undeniable signature mark of a joint lock strike. A technique I had seen Valerie practice 1,000 times on those rubber mats. They weren't just controlling him anymore. They were actively battering him. I picked up my phone and dialed the house number I still knew by heart. My stepmother answered on the third ring, her voice bright and performative. "What is that bruise on my dad's face?" I demanded, my tone dropping to a flat, terrifying baseline that 4 years of combat training had carved into my vocal cords. "He slipped in the garage." My stepmother lied smoothly through the receiver, not missing a single beat. Her voice silk over steel. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. "I will be there in 12 hours. I hung up the phone, grabbed my keys off the hook by the door, and walked to my Jeep. Exactly 12 hours later, I shoved open the heavy front door of the Los Angeles house. The environment had upgraded since I left. Smart locks beeped as the door swung inward, and high-end security cameras studded the ceiling corners with tiny red recording lights. The furniture was new, expensive, chosen to impress visitors. My stepmother was lounging elegantly on a white leather sofa, her legs crossed in a posture of total dominance, a glass of sparkling water sweating on the marble side table. My stepsister sat nearby on a padded bench, aggressively wrapping her knuckles in thick athletic sports tape, pulling each strip tight with her teeth. My dad was hunched over the kitchen island in the open-plan room behind them, chopping vegetables, the heavy chef's knife rattling violently against the wooden cutting board in his trembling hands. The concealer on his cheekbone had been freshly reapplied, thick and cakey, a shade too dark for his skin. "What are you here for?" My stepmother sneered, her eyes raking over my rigid squared posture over the combat boots, the regulation jacket, the flat expression that gave her nothing to read. I didn't blink. I kept my hands entirely clear of my pockets, visible at my sides, fingers loose. "Packing his things, he's coming with me." My stepsister stood up aggressively from the bench, the tape trailing from her fist, and violently cracked her neck joints, rolling her shoulders forward. "You think putting on that camouflage rag makes me scared of you?" She spat, stepping right into my personal space, close enough for me to smell the menthol on her sports tape and the sharp chemical bite of her hair product. She was 3 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier. 4 years ago, that size difference would have pinned me to the rubber mats. Today, I cataloged her center of gravity, her lead foot, and the slight hitch in her left shoulder that telegraphed her jab, all in under 2 seconds. My stepmother rose smoothly from the sofa, casually brushing an invisible crease from her expensive skirt, oozing absolute, calculated malice. "You take him, I will immediately call the cops for kidnapping. I know where your base is. I will write a report to the command, tearing up that military career you are so proud of." She delivered the threat with a porcelain smile, every syllable rehearsed, fully expecting her blackmail to trigger a panic attack in the old, terrified Chloe she remembered starving on a concrete garage floor. She was dead wrong. I absorbed the threat the way I absorbed incoming fire on the range, assess trajectory, measure caliber, determine if the round is even worth ducking. I didn't dignify her threat with a verbal response. Instead, I shifted my cold gaze directly past her shoulder to my dad in the kitchen. He had backed his frail body completely against the tile wall, the chef's knife abandoned on the cutting board, shaking his head furiously in small, pathetic, jerky motions. He actively, desperately avoided making eye contact with me, shrinking his shoulders into the plaster as if trying to fold himself small enough to disappear entirely. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The concealer cracked along the edge of the bruise as his face contorted. The sickening realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water dumped from a helicopter. He wasn't just a trapped victim anymore. He had completely, totally surrendered to his captors, choosing the familiar comfort of his domestic hell over the terrifying courage of escaping with his own daughter. He had been given the door. He chose the cage. 4 years ago, his trembling hand signed my freedom. Today, his trembling body refused his own. According to standard military operating procedures in hostage extraction scenarios, you absolutely cannot rescue a hostage who actively refuses to escape. If the target fights the extraction, they become a fatal liability that endangers the entire team. His cowardice was his deliberate choice, and I flatly refused to let his weakness drag me back into the grave I had clawed my way out of with bleeding fingernails. I absorbed one last long look at the three of them, the predator on the sofa, the enforcer cracking her knuckles, and the willing prisoner who wouldn't meet my eyes. I adjusted the collar of my jacket, sweeping my gaze across the room, cataloging the camera positions and the smart lock model for future reference. I gave my stepmother one last dead-eyed, unblinking stare that held no anger, no sadness, and no plea. Just a target acquisition. I turned sharply on my heel and walked out into the cold night air without uttering another sound. The front door sealed shut behind me with an electronic beep. The battle lines weren't just drawn. The psychological war had officially been declared. I realized in that agonizing moment that you cannot save someone who aggressively chooses to remain a victim. If you've ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to protect your own sanity, hit the like button. Tell me in the comments, how hard was it to finally cut that cord? I drove back to my base, the 12-hour trip grinding past in the dark, fully aware that my stepmother and stepsister couldn't simply let my defiance go unanswered. My sheer existence and financial independence was a glaring, unforgivable insult to their delusion of absolute control over every member of the Bennett family. A disobedient asset was worse than a dead one. The psychological warfare escalated immediately upon my return. One morning, walking to my Jeep at 6:30, I found a black martial arts belt tied tightly around the driver's side windshield. Wiper knotted with deliberate precision. My stepsister's calling card. A few days later, my rear right tire was slashed with a clean professional cut, the rubber peeled back like sliced fruit. Somehow she had illegally bypassed perimeter security by slipping through a blind spot in the civilian contractor fencing near the housing sector. At 3 a.m, my phone screen violently illuminated the dark room with an anonymous text message. You are always a loser. No matter where you hide, I will find you. The Chloe from years ago would have barricaded the door, sobbing and hyperventilating into a pillow. Sergeant Bennett did not shed a tear. Their arrogant, reckless behavior fell perfectly into my tactical projections. Predators who believe they are untouchable always overreach. It is not a question of if, but when. I quietly and methodically established a hardened security perimeter around my federal apartment. I mounted high-end infrared motion sensor cameras covering every blind spot in the exterior hallway and stairwell, running the feeds to a dedicated laptop on my desk. I stripped the standard locks from my front door, replacing them with solid steel core, heavy-duty deadbolts that required over 1,000 pounds of force to breach. Finally, I reached under my mattress and placed my loaded Glock 19 within immediate reach on the nightstand, a round chambered and the weapon positioned exactly 9 inches from my dominant hand. I bypassed the standard 911 function, routing a custom SOS distress signal directly from my phone's power button to the base provost marshal's dispatch. I consciously maintained my resting heart rate at exactly 60 beats per minute, checking the pulse at my wrist every evening before lights out. I refused to report the harassment to the military police right away. A slashed tire or a vague threatening text message from an anonymous number wasn't enough to permanently bury them behind federal bars. I needed irrefutable, overwhelming evidence. I needed to catch them red-handed, breaking down my door with violent intent, crossing the threshold of federal military housing to trigger a full-fledged breaking and entering felony charge on a United States military installation. Every passive move I made, every threatening text I left on read every morning, I calmly replaced the slashed tire without filing a report, was a calculated piece of bait designed to give them just enough rope to hang themselves with their own arrogance. Late one evening, I pulled up the infrared camera footage on my laptop and scrubbed through 3 days of recordings. My stepmother's pearl white Lexus appeared on the perimeter feed 6 separate times in a single week, crawling past the base entrance at 15 miles per hour, the license plate captured clean as a photograph each pass. She was scouting, learning the guard rotation, mapping the gate schedule, I saved every frame to a dedicated hard drive and slid it into my go bag beside the enlistment papers that still bore my dad's broken signature. I deliberately ignored every taunting message, leaving them on read to fuel their rage and feed the delusion that I was too scared to respond. Every morning, I systematically swept the undercarriage of my Jeep for GPS trackers, running my hand along the wheel wells and chassis before starting the engine. I checked the blind corners of every hallway before stepping outside, mapping my route to the motor pool the same way I mapped patrol routes in the field. I operated in absolute terrifying silence. A highly trained sniper knows that the ultimate key to a successful kill isn't aggressively chasing the target through the brush. It is regulating your breathing, maintaining utter physical stillness, and waiting patiently for the arrogant enemy to confidently step right into the center of the kill zone. My stepmother and stepsister thought they were hunting a scared little girl curled up on a rubber mat. They didn't realize they had been marching straight into a federal trap from the moment they tied that black belt around my windshield wiper. The trap snapped shut during a massive coastal storm that slammed into the base, the booming thunder cracking so hard the windows in my housing unit rattled in their frames. At exactly 2 a.m, my phone flashed blinding white on the nightstand. The custom infrared camera system triggered a glaring red alert on my laptop screen. Multiple hostiles aggressively approaching the front door. I watched the grainy thermal feed for 3 seconds. 2 figures moving fast, one dragging a third. I recognized the shapes. I didn't flick on a single light switch. I silently rolled out of bed, bare feet hitting the cold floor, and retreated deep into the pitch-black shadows of the hallway, lowering my center of gravity, pressing my back against the wall. I initiated the 4-count tactical breathing protocol, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds, hold 4 seconds out, 4 seconds. Hold, forcing my adrenaline to flatline. My hand closed around the Glock on the nightstand. I released it. The MPs would handle the firepower. I needed my hands free. A deafening metallic crash echoed above the thunder. The heavy steel hinges ruptured under immense force screws, ripping from the drywall in a shower of plaster dust, and the front door was kicked wide open. My stepsister lunged heavily into the apartment first, freezing rainwater dripping from her slick black leather gloves, her boots tracking mud across my clean floor. She was breathing hard, pupils blown wide, the veins in her neck standing out against her rain-soaked skin. My stepmother strolled in right behind her, casually shaking out and folding her designer umbrella, as if she were arriving at a cocktail party, placing it gently against the wall by the shattered door frame. And the absolute last person dragged over the threshold, stumbling and shivering violently inside a soaked trench coat, was my dad. They had brought him. They had actually brought him as a prop, a human shield they could position between themselves and whatever fight they expected to find. You think putting on this uniform means I won't dare break your leg again. You will always be just a parasitic mutt. My stepsister sneered into the darkness, her head swiveling to locate me, and she immediately charged my position, launching a vicious looping right hook aimed directly at my temple. I slipped the wild punch with a calculated microstep to the left, pivoting my hips and driving a brutal elbow strike right into the soft tissue at the back of her neck. The impact buckled her forward, and she slammed shoulder first into the hallway wall, cracking the drywall. She stumbled hard but instantly recovered, spinning around and unleashing a chaotic flurry of street brawl kicks and wide punches, the kind of undisciplined rage that burned energy fast and left massive openings. It was the raw, unhinged violence of the street, clashing with refined, lethal military combatives drilled into my muscle memory over 4 years. I deflected a heavy looping strike with my forearm, stepped inside her guard, and drove her body forcefully backward into the corner wall, pinning her there with my hip. I locked both my hands tightly around her right wrist and cranked it into a controlled joint lock, bending the elbow past its natural angle. Her face contorted. 1 more pound of twisting pressure and her joint would snap cleanly in 2. But right at that crucial second, my stepmother viciously shoved my dad forward into my direct line of sight, pushing his stumbling, soaked body between me and Valerie like a chess piece, sacrificed to protect the queen. Arthur, look at your daughter. The rebellious child trying to kill her sister. She shrieked, her voice cracking with theatrical hysteria, performing for an audience that wasn't there. Break her arm too, Valerie. Let's see if this cripple can still hold a gun. I froze. My hands locked on Valerie's wrist, but my eyes shifted past her thrashing body and locked intensely onto my dad. He was standing in the middle of my destroyed living room, rain dripping from his trench coat onto the carpet, his thin frame shaking. I waited for him to finally speak, to grab my stepmother's arm, to step forward, to do absolutely anything to stop this madness and protect me. One word, one gesture, one single act of fatherhood. But he just stood there. His eyes were entirely hollow, utterly devoid of any human soul, the same vacant stare he had worn in that armchair 8 years ago when he turned up the TV volume. He actually took a deliberate step backward, actively hiding his frail body behind my stepmother's shoulder, pressing himself against her back like a child clinging to a parent. That ultimate cowardly blood betrayal hit me harder and deeper than any bullet I had ever trained to absorb. It broke my tactical focus for exactly 1/4 of a second, my grip loosening a fraction on Valerie's wrist. That was all my stepsister needed. She violently ripped her arm free from the weakened lock and drove a devastating heavy kick straight into my damaged ribs, the exact same ribs she had been targeting since I was 14. I collapsed hard to the floor, blood instantly pooling warm and copper tasting in my mouth, my cheek pressed against the cold tile. But my thumb was already buried deep inside my pocket, pressing against the cracked phone screen. 3 deliberate practiced presses. SOS. The military police on base required exactly 3 minutes to respond to a Priority 1 distress signal transmitted from federal housing. Armored engines roared to a violent halt directly outside my unit, tires shrieking on the wet pavement. Frantic red and blue strobe lights sliced aggressively through the darkness of my wrecked living room, painting the walls in alternating flashes. My stepmother shielded her eyes, staggering backward. Without warning, a flashbang grenade detonated in the hallway, with a staggering boom that compressed the air in my chest. The blinding white light instantly incapacitated my stepmother and stepsister, sending them reeling backward with their hands clapped over their ears. The military police breached the shattered doorway like a tidal wave of tactical steel, their boots pounding the floorboards in a synchronized thunder that shook the framed pictures off my walls. Moving fluidly among the heavily armed MPs was the SRT team leader, sweeping his rifle expertly through the shadows. His M4 was raised tight against his shoulder, the red aiming laser cutting a clean, unwavering line through the smoke and settling dead center on my stepsister's forehead. Face down. Hands behind your head. The lead MP roared with deafening authority, his voice amplified by sheer adrenaline and absolute command. 2 massive officers slammed my stepsister face first into the tile floor, the impact cracking one of the ceramic squares beneath her cheekbone. Heavy solid steel handcuffs ratcheted brutally around her wrists, the metal teeth biting deep into her skin. She thrashed and bucked against the restraints, snarling like a cornered animal. But the MPs pinned her down with overwhelming force, one knee pressed firmly between her shoulder blades, neutralizing the threat in under 4 seconds. My stepmother lost every ounce of her elegant, calculated facade in a single heartbeat. Her tailored blouse was soaked through her perfectly styled hair, a tangled mess plastered against her face, mascara streaking down her cheeks in black rivers. She thrashed against the arresting officers, clawing at their gloved hands, shrieking at the top of her lungs. "You have no right! I will sue you!" She screamed, her voice cracking into a register I had never heard from her before, the polished control stripped away to reveal the raw, panicking animal underneath. Colonel Thorne, the base security commander, stepped through the splintered doorframe, rain dripping off the brim of his cover. He surveyed the wreckage of my apartment with eyes colder than anything my stepmother had ever manufactured. The shattered door, the cracked drywall, the blood on the floor, the Marine sergeant lying in a heap against the wall. He turned his glacial stare directly onto my stepmother's contorted face. "You just broke into federal military housing, assaulting a Marine sergeant on territory protected by the U.S. military. You have forfeited all civilian rights here. Take them away," he ordered, sealing their fate with absolute finality. 2 MPs hauled my stepmother off the ground by her arms and marched her toward the door. As the MPs violently hauled my stepmother and stepsister toward the shattered threshold, my stepmother twisted her neck and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom, desperately hoping to see the terrified little girl she had collared at that dinner table 8 years ago. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I slowly wiped the blood from my mouth with the back of my hand, pressed my palm flat against the cold floor, and pushed myself upright. I stood up straight shoulders, squared chin level, and looked down at her struggling form being dragged between two officers twice her size. "You told me the weak have no right to choose their future," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, dead calm that cut through the chaos like a scalpel. "Enjoy your federal future." I turned my back on them as they were dragged screaming and thrashing into the storm, the red and blue lights washing over their soaked figures as the armored vehicles swallowed them whole. Months later, the federal courtroom hammered the final nails into their coffins. With impenetrable evidence from the infrared cameras, the military medical records documenting my injuries past and present, and the full testimony of Colonel Thorne's security team, the judge's gavel slammed down with two sharp cracks. 15 years in federal prison for my stepsister. 10 years for my stepmother. The fake empire, the high heels, the Louis Vuitton bags, the wine glasses, the rubber mats, all of it burned to the ground. Following the sentencing, the state authorities ordered my dad into a mandatory psychological and alcohol rehabilitation facility. A few weeks after the verdicts were handed down, I walked through the sliding glass doors of that facility, my boots clicking on the polished linoleum. He was seated in a standard-issue wheelchair by a large window, his thin arms resting on a folded blanket in his lap. His eyes were vacantly tracking the wind blowing across the manicured lawn outside, watching the leaves spin without seeing them. He looked incredibly small in that chair, physically broken. The skin hanging loose on his cheekbones entirely emptied of whatever human spirit had once made him a man who read bedtime stories and graded papers at the kitchen table while my mother pinned tide charts to the refrigerator. I stood rigidly at attention in front of his wheelchair, my shadow falling across his lap. I didn't shed a single tear. My mourning for the father he used to be had finished years ago on a rubber mat in a dark garage watching the TV volume climb. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out the rusted dog tag Master Sergeant Cole had pressed into my palm at that gym, on a morning that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I placed it gently on the small table next to his wheelchair, the metal clinking softly against the laminate surface. The engraved words of Psalm 23:4 gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." I didn't say a single word. I held the silence for 5 full seconds, watching his vacant eyes drift toward the dog tag without recognition, and then I turned on my heel and walked down the long white corridor, leaving the sound of his shallow breathing behind me forever. I drove straight to the coast, stepping out of my Jeep onto the wet sand of the beach where my mother once gripped my hand and pointed at the waves. The ocean was roaring violently, crashing against the shoreline just like it did when she was alive. The white caps rolling over each other in endless, furious repetition. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the sharp, biting scent of sea salt and absolute, hard-won freedom. The dog tag was gone. The silver necklace was gone. The rubber mats, the bakery wages, the burned letter, the locked study, the empty whiskey bottles, the turned-up television, all of it gone. I had finally learned her most important lesson, the one she shouted over the roar of the Pacific when I was too young to understand what it really meant. I didn't turn my back. I charged straight through the darkest wave, and I survived. Utilizing my military network and the robust legal resources afforded to service members, I founded Operation Safe Harbor, a specialized task force and support network designed exclusively to protect and legally defend military personnel suffering from domestic abuse. The organization connected survivors with JAG attorneys, secured emergency protective orders within hours instead of weeks, and provided safe housing on partner installations across the country. The invisible war inside my childhood home had finally ended in complete, decisive victory. But Sergeant Chloe Bennett's lifelong mission to shield others trapped in their own dark garages had just begun. True family isn't always bound by blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand with you as a shield in the storm. If this story gave you the strength to face your own battles, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments below who your chosen family is, and let's keep fighting the good fight.